Welcome to the Short Funk Podcast. This actually is another one of these This Comes Next simulcasts. Listener Arthur Webb poses, why don't, or perhaps should, progressives start organising armed militias in a similar fashion to conservatives? I guess a simpler question would be, why don't or should progressives train to fight? I want to start by saying Arthur Webb is a fellow who I've known since probably 2006 to 2007. Fascinating fellow. Finally had the opportunity to meet him and see him on a regular basis through the Netflix Dungeons & Dragons night, which seemed to be a perfect coincidence that Arthur wanted to play Dungeons & Dragons, and also I had a Dungeons & Dragons evening conveniently already established. Great guy, Arthur Webb. He's an individual who I'm pleased to have met. Always good to know people like Art. In any case, I think this is a really very valid question, and I reflect heavily on probably one of the few political philosophers that I would actually point out I would follow in some degree, and that is the late Fred Hampton, who was murdered in Chicago in the 1960s by the police. Fred Hampton was a member of the Black Panthers. He was one of the founding members of the Black Panthers in Chicago. And he was killed, gunned down mercilessly by the police, who shot tens of rounds into the house where he was, into the room where he was sleeping. And through this, I reflect, if the Panthers had not armed themselves, would the police have used such violent force against Fred Hampton? And I have to say, yes. Of course the police had used such violent force against Fred Hampton. I mean, the justification after the fact was that the Panthers were armed and maybe a shot came back through the wall towards the police, although ballistic evidence after the fact showed that this was not the case. So, in terms of a thinker, a philosopher, someone who I think would have impacted the world very greatly if he'd been allowed to live for even 5 more years, maybe even 2 more years, his death was a direct relationship to the way in which the Panthers had organised themselves. And I am a strong advocate for the Panther means of organisation. My perspective is that the strength the Panthers showed, in large part, was to use a lot of the symbolism that was used against them in their actions, or at least in their public representation. So, in this light, I'm a relatively strong advocate that people of all political persuasions, but in particular, I don't like to use the term progressive. It's been rebranded in recent times to mean nothing. Let's use the term the unauthoritarian left. Let's use the term the group of folks that believe that not only corporations but also the government are suspect. And we need to look at both of them with a certain degree of skepticism. In the US, beautifully, the government represents the corporations. The government could be seen as being the corporations in many ways. So yes, my perspective is people should get weapons training. They should learn how to fire and how to clean firearms. They should learn if a gun jams what you do. They should learn the respect associated with what a loaded firearm actually means, the practical means of handling them, disarming them, these kind of things. I'm hesitant to advocate for gun ownership because my view is, as an adult, there have been small periods of time where I've been accredited to own firearms, but while I've been in the US and the UK, I've not owned firearms. What I own here are bits of metal, which for, 3 to 5 hours worth of work, these bits of metal could be turned into firearms, if I was so practically interested. The 80% firearms movement, the metal that I own, is such a fascinating part of, on one side, open source, on another side, maker communities, on another side, the notion that the government should have no control or action with regards to individuals within a society. I think there's a lot of very curious rhetoric associated with disarming a community. And in the US, there's no practical enforcement of any means of disarming. What I reflect on very strongly is, in my area, everything from small caliber handguns to AK-47s are used on the streets by a variety of different folk. The police don't come when they're called in my area. And in light of this, I periodically have a conversation with my wife associated with, should we arm ourselves? Should we arm ourselves in a variety of different ways? we've come to this conversation many times and we haven't yet armed ourselves based on this conversation. But I think it's incredibly important for people to learn about firearms very practically, to learn about firearms safety, and a loaded firearm is an amazing metaphor for a variety of different things, including email. My perspective with regards to email is oftentimes the email I write are like loaded weapons. And in pressing send, you are firing this loaded weapon. So treat email with the same level of respect that you treat a loaded firearm, and you'll probably have better correspondence accordingly. My view is shaped by a number of my peers as well. It's not an independent view, I think, in any real fashion. A number of folks that I talk to who seem to me to be perfectly rational and well-meaning agree with me associated with these things. So I don't know. I don't think of it as being a pollution of the right. I have known people that have died through firearms injuries, and I know roughly the best way to interact with people that hold firearms to you. I have a distinct sense of the nature of firearms injuries, and also one needs to seek medical treatment as fast as possible in all circumstances. If you're incredibly unlucky and you are shot through the head, for example, your time has come. But in terms of practical disarmament, in terms of the very curious rhetoric that is used associated with firearms, I would thoroughly recommend befriending someone who owns some firearms, learning to shoot the firearms, learning to clean the firearms, and then take this knowledge as something that is unfortunately just part of living in a highly militarized society. Because, as Art notes, the opposition is well armed, well trained, and will use these firearms in random and somewhat unprovoked fashions. And the more you know, the better in these circumstances. This is my own view. I don't know what would happen if it was put out in a This Comes Next recording, but I don't think there's anything like bad knowledge here. And the ownership of firearms is a different thing, but at least having knowledge associated with them puts you in a better standing than someone who knows nothing and is just afraid. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.